Jerkbaits are highly effective bass fishing lures pretty much all year long, but especially in the spring. Today I'm going to share with you some beginner tips for jerkbait fishing so you can catch more fish on them this year. Let's get started. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about the gear you need, the color choices, and the retrieves. But then after this video, my goal is to get out there on the water soon and follow this video up with an on the water fishing video. That way I can explain things today, but then you can actually watch things in action here soon. Hopefully the weather cooperates and I have a little bit of time soon because I definitely want to get on the water and throw these for myself. But in the meantime, let's just talk about jerkbaits. So before I get into my gear recommendations for jerkbait fishing, let's just look at a jerkbait real quick and kind of just define what it is. Essentially, a jerkbait is just a long, slender plug with a diving bill. Very similar to a crankbait. The difference is that this is going to have more of a darting, erratic action in the water. The other big thing about jerkbaits is that they're offered in suspending models. 95% of the jerkbaits out there are meant to suspend. When I say suspend, that means that this jerkbait will dive down and it will hold its position. It's not gonna sink, it's not gonna float, it will just sit there. And that's really the biggest key as to why they're so productive in the early spring. The water temperatures are low, the bass are suspended, these baits dive down, they sit there, they're kind of right there in the bass's face, and they can't resist, so it's an easy meal. Honestly, besides a jerkbait, there's not a lot of other lures out there that do a good job of this. Now, I will say that jerkbaits are also offered in sinking and floating models, and there's a time and a place for those, but for the most part, a suspending jerkbait is pretty much your best friend. Now, just like a crankbait, when you either reel or pull these through the water, they're gonna have a little bit of a shimmy back and forth. It's gonna be a pretty tight wobble most times because of that long, slender profile. Okay, so that's basically what a jerkbait is. Now let's talk about rod, reel, and line that I would recommend to get started. Now, to tell you the truth, I don't own a rod and reel specifically for jerkbaits. I just make what I have work. I'm gonna try to retrofit my topwater rod and make it work for jerkbaits. In my opinion, I would say anything from about a 6'6" to a 6'10" rod is a pretty good range for jerkbait fishing. Additionally, I would opt for a medium power and a fast action. I personally like a fast tip because when it comes to working my bait, it allows me to have a little bit more control over my bait. I also feel like I can detect bites a little bit easier, but at the same time, I want it to be soft enough to where when I do set the hook, it loads up those treble hooks okay, and you don't pull the hooks out of the fish's mouth. The rod that I'm specifically using is a Shimano Curado. This is a 6'10" model, and I believe it's actually made for topwaters and jerkbaits. I like the 6'10". It allows me to cast a jerkbait as far as I'd ever need to, but at the same time, it's short enough to where I have control over that bait and I have pinpoint accuracy if I want to work it around brush piles and stuff like that. All in all, you can absolutely vary your rod length based on personal preference, but I guess if I was to choose one length that would be perfect for jerkbaits, I feel like a 6'8" would be that money spot. The reason being is that when you're working a jerkbait, you're usually working that rod tip down. Whether you're fishing in a boat, a kayak, or from bank, a 6'8" rod, I feel like it gives you the control over your bait. But it's still long enough to where you can bury the hooks on a long cast. So I feel like 6'8" is what I would personally choose, but again, that's not the end of the world. As far as choosing a reel goes, I would say you can really choose whatever casting reel you like. Personally, I like a high-speed reel so I can catch up with those fish. If you use something too slow and they're running right at you, you might not be able to keep up with those fish and keep them pinned. So personally, I like to use something a little higher speed. And then the last component, and honestly, probably one of the most important, is the line choice. Now this year, to tell you the truth, I'm gonna do some experimenting and I'm actually gonna run a fluorocarbon leader on braid. The only reason is because, like I said, I'm retrofitting my topwater rod and reel, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. I would say ideally you use straight fluorocarbon, anywhere from 8 to 12 pound test. If the water's really clear in your area and you don't have a ton of cover that the bass can get buried in, 8 or 6 pound test is great. If the water's a little stained, you can get away with 10 or 12. And then if you've got a lot of cover in your area and you're afraid that those bass will bury you in a brush pile, you might opt for something like a 12 pound test. Honestly, I have no idea what to expect from the whole braid to fluorocarbon thing. I love using braid with a fluorocarbon leader on my spinning rod and reels, but I don't do it a whole lot on casting equipment. I didn't really want to strip all this good braid off of my reel and replace it with fluorocarbon. That would get really expensive really fast. So we're gonna see what happens. Maybe I'll love it, maybe I'll hate it. I guess time will tell. So that pretty much covers down on things for the rod, reel, and line, but now let's talk about colors. That's the fun part. Let's get to it. Just like every other hard bait out there, there's about 1.2 trillion color combinations you can go with for jerkbait fishing, but today I'm gonna try to simplify things because quite honestly, you don't need that many colors. When it comes to picking a color for jerkbait fishing, it really comes down to the same factors as any other hard bait. The forage, the water clarity, and the sun penetration. Now, ultimately, no matter where you're at, when it comes to bass fishing, you should always factor in what those bass are actually feeding on. So in situations where the bass feed heavily on shad and other bait fish, you might go with colors like this, but in situations where bass feed heavily on perch and bluegill, you might go with colors like this. That's obvious, right? But once you determine what kind of forage you want to mimic, you gotta factor in the water clarity. Now I will say this, with jerkbaits, I tend not to fish really dirty water. If the water's really, really muddy, then I'm gonna go with something like a jig or a chatterbait or spinnerbait. I feel like those will actually outproduce a jerkbait in those situations. But I will fish a jerkbait in anything that's not like chocolate milk. So if the water's super clear, you obviously might go with something that's really natural, but if the water's got a little bit of a stain to it, you might go with something with a little bit more flash, a little bit more noise to it, which really gets those fish to hone in on your lures. Okay, so after you determine what forage you want to mimic and what the water clarity is, then you got to factor in the sun. If it's really sunny, that's obviously a lot of light penetration, and it's going to allow those fish to see your bait that much better. The one thing to remember is that these jerkbaits are suspending and they're sitting in front of those fish for a long time, and so those fish really have a good chance to look at it. So color actually makes a huge difference. In situations where it's really sunny, I'm going to start to bust out some of my translucent patterns, whereas in situations where it's a little more overcast, I'm going to start to opt for stuff that's a little bit more of a painted color. This one is just straight up white right here, and this is actually one of my top confidence colors for jerkbait fishing. I love this thing. On an overcast day in clear water, this thing slaps. Did I use slaps in the right context? I'm not 14 years old, so I'm not 100% sure what it means. Let me know. Anyways, I hope those little visual examples helped you determine what colors might be good for your bodies of water. If you have further questions, obviously you can drop a comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Personally, one of the colors that I'm most excited about is this yellow perch color right here. As you've seen in a lot of my videos, I tend to catch a lot of small yellow perch about that long. Well, look at this jerkbait. It pretty much looks identical to them. The other thing to remember is that most of the bodies of water that I fish around here have pretty clear water, so I feel like this is gonna be dynamite. I guess technically speaking, now would be a good time to talk about what brands you might consider purchasing. That being said, I'm not going to tell you what brand to buy, but I will tell you some of the ones that I do believe make a nice jerkbait. Megabass is probably some of the nicest jerkbaits out there, but honestly, I don't really feel like spending $25 to $30. So some of the more budget-friendly jerkbait options would be stuff like Lucky Craft, Strike King, Rapala. I'm actually going to play around with some Berkley jerkbaits this year. They're pretty inexpensive, and I'm pretty excited to try them out. More to come once I get on the water, obviously. Anyways, I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think there's a lot of bad jerkbaits out there, but there are some that are going to be a little bit nicer and higher quality, and they're probably going to draw a few more bites. Ultimately, you need to make that decision for yourself. If I was competitively fishing, I would probably buy some Megabass, but I'm not competitively fishing, so I don't feel like I need to spend that kind of money for a hard bait, especially when a pike is probably going to bite it off anyways. Some of the things to consider when you are choosing a jerkbait is really how well does it cast, and then how well does it suspend. If you can really cast it well out there and have good accuracy with it, and it suspends nicely in the water column, I would say that's a pretty good jerkbait. And then the other thing to consider obviously would just be like the patterns and what colors they offer. If they offer something that you feel will be highly productive in your area, that's also a determining factor. We have talked about what a jerkbait is. We've talked about what gear you need. We've talked about color selection and maybe some of the brands to consider. Now let's talk about how you actually work these baits right here. And like I said, I plan to do an on the water video very soon, so make sure to click that subscribe button down below and stay tuned, because I'm hoping to go catch some fish for you, and that way you can actually see firsthand exactly how I work these things. But in the meantime, let me give you a few tips to get you started. Honestly, it's not even that difficult to work a jerkbait, but one of the biggest thing that this is going to test is your patience and your discipline. The first thing that you're going to do, just like anything else, you're going to cast that puppy out there. Once it hits the water, you're going to go ahead and reel it down a couple times and maybe twitch your rod tip down a few times just to get that bait down in the strike zone. And now we're to the point where you actually begin your retrieve. Now this is where, technically speaking, you can get pretty darn creative. Personally, what I like to do is I like to do jerk, jerk, pause. And so I'll just jerk that rod tip down slightly, just kind of bounce it like this, jerk, jerk, pause, and then I'll wait anywhere from 5 to 10 seconds. I am not a patient person, so a lot of times I end up working my jerkbait too fast, but if you're patient, you might buy yourself a couple bites that I would have never got. Honestly, I know some people that would pause their jerkbaits for 30 seconds to a minute at a time. I can't do that. I can't do it personally. I don't know how people do that, but they caught a lot of fish on jerkbaits, so respect. Anyways, like I said, the jerk, jerk, pause, retrieve is my starter. It's where I usually end up. It works 90% of the time. You just jerk, jerk, pause, 5 seconds, jerk, jerk, pause, 5 seconds. The colder the water, the longer the pause, so on and so forth. When you're getting to the point where it's like 50-degree water, you might be going jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, jerk, pause. You get the point. But here's the important part. You have to experiment out there. You might do jerk, 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 pause. You might do jerk, jerk, pause, jerk, 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 pause, jerk, jerk, pause. Honestly, you just have to come up with a cadence, experiment with that cadence, and then once you get bit, remember what cadence you were using when you caught that fish, and then try to replicate and replicate and replicate. After you catch 2 or 3 fish on one retrieve, that's a darn good sign that you should stick to that retrieve. So let's say, for example, I go to my local lake. I work a jerk, jerk, pause for the first 20 minutes. I'm not catching anything. So I start to work it a little bit slower. I go jerk, pause, and I'm waiting 10 to 12 seconds. All of a sudden, I notice I get bit 8 seconds in on a pause. So I'm like, all right, so I'm gonna hold off and I'm gonna pause it for longer. And then my next fish bites and it was 10 seconds on a pause. Well, I'm gonna make mental notes of this and I'm gonna continue to listen to those fish and cater to how they want to eat the jerkbait. The other thing that you're gonna need to do is monitor how those fish are eating your jerkbait. Are they just getting that back treble just really lightly on the edge of their mouth, or are they full on throttling the thing? If they're throttling the thing, that's a pretty darn good sign that you're using the right color. But if they're just barely getting hooked or swiping at it, maybe getting foul hooked in the back of their head, that might be a sign that you might need to change your color up a little bit. Ultimately, I can't really tell you exactly how to work a jerkbait because every time on the water it might be slightly different. My biggest piece of advice would really be to experiment, be patient, and then once those fish start eating it, really make those mental notes and try to replicate. And I guess if you do that, you're probably gonna have a lot of fun with a jerkbait. Okay, I'm trying to decide if I missed anything today, and I honestly don't know. So if there's anything that I missed or if you have questions on, feel free to drop a comment below and I'll get back to that as soon as I can. I'm obviously not an expert, but I've been fishing jerkbaits a long time and it's something that I have a lot of confidence in. Like I said a couple times, make sure to stay tuned. I'm super excited to get out there and start fishing these jerkbaits. I'm definitely gonna make some videos with them. So I'm looking forward to that, and I hope you are as well. Anyways, thank you so very much for watching today's video. I hope spring is off to a great start for you and you're catching a lot of fish. We'll catch you next time.